already said it with the video. So I would say ditto. The whole point of this 2017 recommendation is really to make sure that we do not disconnect the scientific endeavor to what is happening in the world. The reality, and as I said it in the panel that we had this morning, is that we should ask ourselves not whether science is a right, which we believe it is, but how much science is upholding our rights to live on an equal world where inequalities are not rampant as they are, our right to live in a clean environment and not subsidizing fossil fuels as we are doing as we speak, a right to have equal opportunities, women in general. I'm not talking about the scientific world, I'm just talking about in general. So these rights of people, and in this context of the World Science Forum, and the topic that is social justice, the right to be in a world that is much more sustainable, informed by science. And as I said yesterday, it's of course we need to invest in science. Of course, science needs to be inclusive. Of course, it not need to be only of those economies that have the possibility to invest so much on these institutions and research and developments. Also, the Global South needs to have more voice into finding the solutions. But the fact is that first and foremost, we need to benefit from the scientific endeavors. And I don't think we're doing it as much as we should. For all the benefits we have, science is not really delivering as much as it should because of issues that does not concern science. It concerns, as I said, the political economy and vested interest. So my call is to say, let's make science count. Let's bring the evidence to the table. Let's make it unavoidable that the policies that we take are based on good science. Because as you said yesterday also, there might be bad science. I'm an economist, and I'm always amazed by the general equilibrium model that continues to pervade the teaching of economics. There's no general equilibrium model. There's no representative agent. There is not average citizens. We know it, and it continues to be taught. And therefore, I feel that we really need to debunk these notions and try to build more scientific evidence. And then you go into the question of the scientific community and the ecosystem, and there again I feel is not only about the outcomes of the scientific endeavors, but the process. Women not being represented, Global South not being represented, scientific endeavors being captured by where the money goes instead of really going into the substance of what we really want to address. The financing of science is also something related to our rights in terms of what is tackled and how it is tackled. But then the other part that I'm really fond of, and I have to say that, as I said, I'm an economist. When I get into the social and human science of UNESCO, they tell me that I'm in charge of ethics, or the question of human rights is a huge, huge endeavor. But the reality is that the framing of human rights-based approach is about inclusion, it's about fairness, it's about non-discrimination, it's about all the things we care about. So I really think this is the right way to frame the issues. And a final comment, the question of the right of the scientist to produce the science they think they should, to be protected. At UNESCO, we are the guardians of the protection of journalism and journalists, which are also being attacked massively. We are in charge of the right of educators in the education sector. I think that we should also think about the rights of researchers, rights of scientific people that have been, we saw it. I mean, the fact it can be just said like that, but the managing of COVID, whenever any researcher would come with something that was not to the like of certain governments, they will just be completely bashed in terms of debunk in their findings. So I feel that the scientific, the protection of science and the protection of scientists is also a very important endeavor. And link it to the process. If we are protecting the freedom of speech, we need to protect the freedom of thought, and we need to protect the freedom of researchers. And so I recommend this also. Super good. And I hope that you also support us in this pushing for full implementation of the 2017 recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela, for the strong message. Let me now turn to Sir Peter Gluckman. For those who don't know, and I'm sure there are very few, he is the president of the International Science Council and the chair of the COVID project for ISC. He is an internationally recognized biomedical scientist and former chief science advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand. He is the recently retired chair of the International Network for Government Science Advice. Sir Gluckman, the ISC is an organization that brings together natural and social and human sciences. And I would like to ask you, what is the vision of your organization on the relationship between science and human rights?
Well, I think Gabriela said a lot of it, but I would agree with everything that she said. But I think it's important, why did we make the merger? Why did we merge the social and natural sciences? The reality is that one cannot impact on society from knowledge without including the social sciences and humanities. And I think if we go back to where science has come from, we need to recognise that the science system itself has to change. It's easy to criticise the political process and the policy process, but we ourselves have created a model which is not ideal. We have incentives which are built around building an industry of keeping scientists employed and producing outputs called bibliometric outputs, which are not necessarily going to impact on the world out there. And we need to think about that seriously. And so I would remind one that it's not that long ago that people like Robert Merton were talking about scientists as if they were priests standing at the altar preaching truths to the world. Science doesn't produce truths. Science is a way of having better understandings in a relatively reliable way about the world around us and within us. And as I said last night, we need to remind ourselves that science is principles-based, but the way science is used is values-based. And therefore, the need to bridge between the traditional ways that science has moved and the fact for all the science that has been done claiming relevance to the sustainability agenda and how much impact it's actually had on the sustainability agenda, there's a huge gap. So let's just take an example away from COVID for a moment. Think about climate change. Yes, we need more science around batteries and green energy and et cetera, but the bulk of the money in climate change research still goes on what will happen to sea level rise in 2050 or 2100 on areas like that. Where's the science on why do policymakers resist responding to the risk assessments that exist? Where's the science on what would change the behaviour of societies so that better choices were made for the long term? The science that we need actually on climate change is largely social and human sciences. Yes, we need the technological sciences, but the system doesn't reward that research. So we need to look at ourselves. Now, I could go on, but Gabriela's talked about the other side of it. But just to finish, I cannot think of not one thing that any society, any community faces where science cannot make a difference to better decision making, whether it's by the community or by the policymaker. Not every scientist can be a person who can communicate across that boundary, nor should they be. We need scientists who are going to find out more and more in any particular normative issue, instrumental issue. But we do need to produce a far better cadre of scientists who know how to talk to the policy community, who know how to have one step in the policy community, as well as in the academic community, and one step in society. And that's where the ISC is putting a lot of effort. to think about what does transdisciplinary research mean, which bridges these gaps between stakeholders in the science community. We need new models to do research without throwing out what we've already got, because we still need basic science, we still need discovery science, we still need disciplinary applied science, be it in any domain of science, but we need better ways of working with stakeholders.
Thank you very much. I really liked the point that you made about and the distinction between the principle-based development of science and the value-based use of science. And then something else that is very important, and this is part of the thinking around the development of the right to science, is the element of anticipation, and how much is it a legal obligation to talk about precaution, to talk about prevention and due diligence. So I'm happy to turn to Julia Mackenzie. She's the Chief Program Officer for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, known as AAAS. Julia is providing leadership to the diverse area of high-impact programs at AAAS, including science, technology, policy fellowships, scientific responsibility. She works also on diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM education. So AAAS has been an organization that has supported UNESCO efforts in the field of standard setting, and actually AAAS was there with us back in the 1970s when the predecessor of the recommendation on science and scientific researches was initially developed before it was recently revised. So with that heritage, if I can say, with AAAS, I would like to hear from you, what is the vision of your organization regarding this relationship between science and human rights?
Thank you. So we are focused, and we have been, as you said, from the 70s onward, on the right to science and the intersection between science and human rights, science and the law. So what the team specifically, led by Teresa Harris, my great colleague who's worked with Costas on a number of projects, is focused on is really the highest level vision of that team is an ecosystem where trustworthy science thrives. That team is then, to some of Peter's points, then focused on how ensuring that that trustworthy science, its process and its products, are linked with certain groups in particular. And to Gabriella's points, not looking at the population as a population, but rather looking at where are the strategic points of interaction, where do we work hard and long to build trustworthy, deep relationships with practitioners such as human rights practitioners, the judiciary, journalists who increasingly are spread thin in their portfolios, policymakers, and in the U.S. context, policymakers not just at the federal level, but also at the local and state level. So we are deeply committed to the right to science and that vision of an ecosystem where trustworthy science thrives. It really also, pulling on points made by this esteemed panelist so far, it really requires that at this time we also acknowledge and really lean in toward the fact that there are communities who have not benefited from the process and products of science, and do the hard work of building relationships of trust, which take a long time to build up and can be it can be broken down quite easily. So we are really committed to ensuring that the intellectual work that has developed in partnership with UNESCO and others is applied really practically so that practicing scientists understand the right to science and their role within this trustworthy ecosystem, and that is connected effectively to other practitioners and to the communities that we want to benefit from science, acknowledging that some have not to date as much as others. And this is true in a U.S. context, and it's also true in a global context, of course.
Thank you, Julia, for your points, and particularly for highlighting the local level action as a key layer where difference can be made, but also bringing to the forefront the issue of trust. And this is something we will go back to when we look at the pandemic. I would like to give the floor to Professor Reddy. Daya Reddy is Professor Emeritus at the University of Cape Town. He holds a South African Research Chair in Computational and Applied Mechanics, and he is the Director of the Center for Research in Computational and Applied Mechanics. Professor Reddy, I would like to hear from you, being a natural scientist. How do you see the connection between science and human rights?
Thank you very much, Kostas, and good morning, everybody. Well, let me start on the topic of human rights. Let's start with the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which refers to the right of everybody to share in scientific advancements and the benefits that accrue from science. But that's more or less as far as it goes. What concerns me, and I think should concern society more broadly, are the notions of freedom and responsibility in science. Talking first of all about freedom, that is the freedom of scientists to associate in carrying out their scientific work, to have equitable access to scientific results. So freedom is not simply the absence of a constraint, but really the notion that there should be enablers of that kind of freedom, scientific freedom as well. The ISC has the notions of freedom and responsibility in science embedded or enshrined, if you like, in its statutes, where it asserts these as principles. So one might ask, well, you have the Declaration on Human Rights. We have the principles, if you like, of freedom and responsibility in science. One might ask, well, why? Why is it that scientists should have these kinds of freedoms, which may very well be denied to other segments of society in different parts of the world? Well, for the very simple reason, and this is set out, for example, in the Bonn Declaration, for the very simple reason that this kind of scientific freedom is a necessary condition, not sufficient, unfortunately, but it's a necessary condition for progress in society, for science to be able to make the kinds of contributions that would allow for progress in society, to combat the various threats that it might face, develop technologically and otherwise. So, in other words, there is this relationship between scientific freedom and science as a common good, and being able to be enjoyed, if you like, and appreciated as a common good. So legislation is not enough, and one will find legislation, policies, constitutions, and the like, which to some extent or other, and perhaps sometimes implicitly, support the notions that I've been talking about. But one needs to go beyond that, because, as I said, freedom is not defined merely as the absence of constraints. There are notions of equitable access, and here we might think about scientists and scientific communities in the global south, for example, which for one reason or another are often cut off from the mainstreams of scientific development, are marginalized. And we have, turning to notions of scientific responsibility, we have a responsibility as scientists and scientific organizations such as academies and disciplinary unions and the like, to ensure that we make those kinds of connections. There are various enablers, and I'll just mention briefly open science, the notion of open science as an enabler, what makes it possible for scientists everywhere to have this kind of access, whether it is to data, to results, and also to be able to commune, to work together. It's important also, I think, to be aware of, and I'm thinking and talking very much as a scientist, about the curbs on scientific freedom that are there, sometimes explicitly, but sometimes, shall we say, self-imposed. For example, we've all witnessed the kinds of ideological tensions that have led to a kind of increased scrutiny of scholars. These are really resulting from, shall we say, ideological positions, political agendas, and the like. And the result, in many cases, is almost a kind of self-censorship of scientists and scholars more broadly. So they have scientific freedom, but they feel a constraint in exercising that kind of that scientific freedom. I'll leave it at there for now. Thank you, Kostas.
Thank you, Professor Reddy, especially for the last point on self-censorship as a key challenge. And now let me turn to the last perspective for this first round of questions. So that would be Professor Siyabulela Fobosi. Professor Fobosi is a senior researcher and the acting head of the UNESCO Oliver Tambo Chair in Human Rights at the University of Fort Hare. He is a practitioner of human rights and fields. He covers fields such as basic education, public health, and he's also a member of the South African Sociological Association. So, Dr. Fobosi, you're coming from the human rights angle, and I would like to hear from you. How do you see the right to science connecting and being maybe the foundation of this relationship between science and human rights? You have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Kostas. That's an excellent question, simply because it's something that we have to talk about, and I'm happy that we are all here to talk about these issues, the issues that don't benefit some of the ordinary people. But first of all, let me just think about science itself. What is science? There tends to be a way in which the general public or academics, or as it were, or scientists, as they call them, refer to science in relation to only medicines or engineering. And I would like to think that's a narrow view. So that's a narrow view, because I think science is the state of inquiry. So a state of inquiry where, everyone is involved, in discovering, various ways of changing the world. A state of, action, between humans. Where culture is also involved, cultural practices are involved. So in a state where there's a change in the world in terms of, for example, your development. So in that regard, then I would like to speak to refer rather to the right to science in relation to the right to development, because I think these two go hand in hand. So you can't talk about the right to science without referring to the right to development, because any practices of right to science that is being discovered, if I'm going to put it that way, whether it's in the form of new development in a development area, so it needs to benefit everyone, in that area. So it should not be a development that only benefits those who are implementing it. Should also, I think, uplift, what Frantz Fanon refers to as the rest of the earth. So the underclass, the underground, so they should benefit from those. So that's where we then push for human rights, for the rights, of those people to be realized, for the rights of the people to live in a conducive environment, for the rights of the people to benefit from what I would call quality education, not just education, but the quality of that education. And the right of the people to use, a decent public transport system, which continues to be, unrealized, at least in South Africa, because that's one of the areas that I think the country is still struggling in, to make sure that the issues that are facing, the public transport sector are addressed, and new developments are brought in to ensure that things are changed for the better. And there's also issues relating to the poor development in your rural areas, for example. So how then does the right to science speak to those people? How does the right to science ensure that those people are uplifted? So I'm of the view that the focus on that needs to ensure that people are empowered to any form of development or to any knowledge, as it were, that is seeking to address the problems that the country is facing, or anywhere in the world, So, but at the moment, science remains, the right to science rather remains neglected or ignored, at least by those in power. So I'm of the view that then there needs to be a change in that regard to ensure that those in power are practicing, what they say they want to do in terms of, empowering the underclass, the underground, to have their rights realized. So therefore, I think human rights definitely go hand in hand, with the right to culture. So in the right to culture says every cultural practice is important. So everyone should be involved, in those developments or changes that are being brought. So therefore, the right to science relates to the right to culture. So we need to be, I think, very much specific in that regard in combining the two. So I've spoken about the right to science, the right to development, and the right to culture. So I think those three are very important, Constance and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Sia, for making the connection between science, the right to science, and culture. Actually, if I take you back to the times when the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights was drafted, and UNESCO was contributing to that drafting process, our Director General was making explicit that connection, that culture is a key issue in relation to understanding science. So we have completed a first round of discussion, but let's now go closer to the issue of our conversation, pandemics. And I would like to turn to Gabriela. And Gabriela, I would like to hear from you, what are the main issues and challenges that you see from the UNESCO perspective in relation to the pandemic?
That's a very big question, and I was actually happy to participate in the Lancet Commission on COVID with Jeffrey Sachs, and with the committees on science and technology. We also produce a lot of papers. We're producing now also an analysis of what did we learn with the pandemic, and we always hear this question of never let a good crisis go without being used, and therefore I think it's very important that we get the lessons. There are very positive lessons. I think that it showed a way in which international cooperation, open science, the sharing of knowledge, the sharing of data, the really getting this flow of information between different jurisdictions to look for the cure, to look for the management of the things, I think was really good. The fact that many journals opened their access to databases and information was great, and the fact that you had this international cooperation going on. Public-private partnerships, amazing. The production of vaccines would not have happened with this massive flow of public money and the knowledge that the innovation system in the private sector had for the vaccine production. That was another really high mark that I think we should learn from it. But linked to these very impressive positive outcomes that we just need to disentangle and say, okay, let's just look at them and see what are the drivers, and let's just try to reproduce them because they were great. You add up a very ugly face, which is not only about not sharing equally the benefits of science in terms of having only now 16% of the population in the south vaccinated, while 80% in the north had been vaccinated. But thinking about, and this is just mind-boggling, because WHO created the COVAX platform to distribute the vaccines to everybody. But then they didn't have the vaccine, because the vaccine, as soon as it was produced, it was put in the market with the very same market rules of profits for those that are selling it. And therefore you have the vaccine hoarding, and therefore countries buying 3 times the dose they need and stopping because you didn't share the IPR for producing the vaccines in places that could have been produced. And you have the WTO waiver for the patent rights, and that should have been used. It's just like that. It was produced by public money, but this international cooperation is only you put it in the market with market rules. I think that was immoral, talking about values. It was immoral, and it led to a lot of crises. And therefore, I would say we need to look at patent rights. I mean, we saw it. I mean, I'm not saying that we're going to not protect innovation, but it showed that it's excessive sometimes, and it's so excessive that even with the massive impact of this pandemic killing people, we could not go to a benefit we had in the WTO to have a waiver for patents for producing it all around the world. I think this is the core of how do we ensure that the benefits of science come to the core, and that we get, as I said, always this vested interest that are informing our issues. And then you go on and on, because it's not only about COVID, it's about respirators, it's about health coverage. I mean, health should be a right. We have been saying that. And so let's go to the broader issue of how these scientific endeavors can benefit people, and they did not. Because we know all these stories where people could not have access to health coverage, and I think this is really another area that we need to look into very closely when we. I hope sometime we will be rebuilding the system better, because we got a war in the way, and therefore all the things that we were thinking on putting together to ensure that all the vulnerabilities that we have before the COVID crisis in terms of health systems, in terms of coverage, in terms of scientific research, in terms of all these things are in a hold, and I hope that we will not lose the drive of all what we learn from this experience. And all of these things, of course, relate to the ethics of these issues and to the human rights of these issues. The other point I have to say is the question of protection of scientific personnel, and again, this is core. We should not forget the fact that sometimes when researchers, when these epidemiologists, when these sociologists, psychologists came out with their findings, and if the findings were not welcome in a high stress situation, they were really attacked, and we have hundreds of attacks to scientific. They should be protected, because this is creating this environment where they don't feel free to go and deliver what they need to deliver, and at the end, again, I'm probably too much not as my colleagues here in the scientific ecosystem. I'm more into the scientific policy nexus, and sometimes I feel that we go for evidence. No, it's more policy-based evidence instead of evidence-based policy. And therefore, we just need to be sure that this doesn't happen, and that we let scholars really go for sharing their research and having the freedom to do it and being protected for this very constraining context where we're seeing more and more populists. And then you get into this vicious cycle because of the outcomes that have not been inclusive. People don't trust science. Then you don't trust science, and then it's just very, very dangerous. And I feel that we're here to make science count and to ensure that we do not get into these issues as we go forward.
Thank you, Gabriela, for reminding us that there are positive messages that we need to cherish from this experience, in addition to the challenges that you enumerated. Let me turn to Peter Gluckman. ISE has done a lot of work in the period of the pandemic, studying what has happened, the responses. What are the key findings and what are the key messages that you would like to share based on that?
Well, just by way of background, starting in December 2020, the ISC chose to undertake its biggest ever project, which was to engage with a broad range of social and natural sciences from all geographies of the world to see it was in two parts. First, to understand the different scenarios that might emerge depending on different levels of effective vaccination in the face of continuing viral evolution. And secondly, and more relevant to today, to discuss what were the lessons to learn from the pandemic. And the lessons are large, and I would encourage you to look at our report, Unprecedented and Unfinished, which is on the ISC website, because I can only make a few points now unless you give me several hours. The first point I want to make, however, is that scientists had long predicted that there would be a viral zoonotic pandemic of this scale. All said and done, there'd been Ebola, there'd been SARS, there'd been MERS, there'd been Zika, etc., etc. And we had an absolute failure around the world of scientific risk assessments to have engaged preemptively and proactively into public policy. And there's something deep in that, and I could spend a long time specifically on why it is that we have failed to understand, and we don't understand, how to improve what I call risk listening rather than risk assessment. How do you actually persuade the policymaker to listen to risk assessments and to act on them? And there was a total failure in that regard in every country, with the possible exception of the 2 or 3 Eastern countries that had recently experienced SARS. Secondly, I think most governments failed to understand cascading risk. Most scientists failed to understand cascading risk. This was soon not just a health crisis, it was an educational crisis, it was a mental health crisis, it was a social care crisis, it was a gender crisis, increase in family violence, etc., etc., etc. It became late to the piece in most countries. And even now, I think many countries are wanting to pretend all of it's behind us and understanding the ongoing issues in education, in care, in economics, etc., etc. I could go on at length. Most obviously, the sustainability agenda has been put back a long way by this. The geostrategic crises of today have probably been precipitated by the shift in policy focus. And then Gabriela's talked about the positive impact on the STI system. We've seen in the STI system the emergence of new forms of publication, the new forms of open science, new forms of collaboration. We're seeing, I think it is forcing scientists to think far more about their position in the public square than they were doing before. That's got some upsides and downsides I'll come onto. But we've also seen the politicization of science. Which part, whether you believe in masks or don't believe in masks or vaccination or not, has become a badge of partisan alignment in some countries and has been part of this extreme polarization which has emerged in many countries. Science has been positioned on one part of that pole or the other. And I think we have a huge issue now about disinformation, about trust in science, which we need to think about and merits a whole forum on its own in its own right. I think it's an issue which the ISC is putting right at the top of the agenda, and we've had the World Health Organization actually come to us and ask us to think about the lessons about how we stop distrust in science confounding the next pandemic that comes along. I think there's also a failure of science advisory mechanisms. You might be surprised why I say failure. Because what we saw was narrow inputs from the science advisory system. Governments turned to their epidemiologists or their modelers, but didn't bring in their behavioural scientists or their social scientists or their educational scientists until much later in the piece. And I think it comes back to this issue of cascading risk. We found scientists competing for access to be the ones who would influence what governments would do. You know, I'm the great modeler, therefore I must be the one who gives advice. I'm the virologist, I know. And we saw the public being confused by the public debates that scientists entered into. Now, scientists should debate what's not unknown, but they should not be taking positions just to magnify their celebrity status in a crisis. I hate to say it, but we saw it. And we saw, and sadly, a failure of the multilateral system. Now, whether we don't want to go into the debates of what happened at the WHO in the early time of the pandemic, but we cannot pretend that the multilateral system responded well and quickly, whether it's in the alerting of the pandemic, whether it's in the management of the vaccines, etc., etc., etc. And look, 2.5 years or more, nearly 3 years into the pandemic, we're not making real progress on a decent new pandemic treaty. We're not making progress on resolving the issues that need to be resolved. Yes, the international health regulations are still the international health regulations which were written in 2005 before SARS even appeared, before molecular biology really appeared, to be able to move on genomics, etc., etc., etc. To go further, the Convention on Biological Warfare still has no scientific regime associated with it. What's the difference between an anthropogenic and a naturally occurring virus in terms of the public good? This is the one arms convention for which there is absolutely no scientific support. 30, 40 years on, the world has not yet resolved something as basic as biological warfare. All I will say is I'll stop there to say there's going to be a new edition of the report, and probably in the first quarter next year, which is just updating the lessons from a bit more reflection on these issues. But fundamentally, science showed that it could work cooperatively and multilaterally. I'm not sure the world showed it.
Thank you very much. You now have a good reason why you need to monitor the IAC website regularly. And let me turn to Julia. Julia, you have been, together with your colleagues, involved in a nice research project that we launched between us and AAAS, looking at the right to science in the context of Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030, but really taking a dive with a focus on the pandemic. And perhaps we would like to hear from you some of the key findings in relation to scientific freedom.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Before I do that, I do want to pivot just a little bit, acknowledging that the very real challenges you've spoken to are real. I want to invoke something that my CEO invoked at the opening ceremony, which is the joy and wonder in science, and that even in the context of the pandemic, we witnessed that. Right? That there was a remarkable pace of the development of a type of vaccine that had not been used before. So while it was not enough, it is my privilege to have colleagues who were the editors, who were one end of a very large and complex machinery that produced that science, ensured it was sound, published it, and then onwards, governments, manufactured the vaccine. Have there been issues in uptake? Are there massive, complex issues? Absolutely. But we also need to celebrate, right? The president celebrated in his opening ceremony remarks that for the first time in the near future, there will be the ability to manufacture mRNA-based vaccines here in Africa. These are remarkable accomplishments. It makes me think of my mother. Perfection is not an option. But it's important, right, if I can invoke another colleague of mine, Dr. Shirley Malcolm, when we were discussing just yesterday the deeply important work we need to do to ensure that science actually is inclusive. The scientific enterprise itself fixes its issues. She quoted James Baldwin, and now I'm going to mess it up, but we can't change everything we face, but we won't change what we don't face. So it's so important, with that kind of aspirational lens, I'll pivot back to my assignment, which is that my colleagues, together with Costas, produced a document that really looks at this intersection between the right to science, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and then looks at COVID-19 as essentially a massive case study in what really happens at this intersection. It came up with a number of key findings. It will hopefully be out relatively soon, but I can just highlight a few of those. One was to underscore once again that everyone has a human right to enjoy the benefits of scientific products and the process of science. We must protect, as we've heard several times throughout this talk, we must protect scientific work, discussion, and dissemination. There are very real new complexities about how to do that in an open science world, right? How to have open data and how to have curated science that is supported in a thoughtful manner. That science cannot be enjoyed if scientific freedom and responsibility are not upheld. And COVID-19 put into stark contrast, as other global challenges do, as Peter discussed, that we have a shared global duty to protect health, education, and well-being. And again, we've heard, I think, the last two key findings we've heard some echoes of throughout the day today, which is that cooperation is essential, not just across nations, but also between disciplines and sectors and various fields. That's essential to achieving the SDGs and the right to science. And finally, that we must build and maintain trust in science, right, as well discussed. An era of rapidly rising mis and disinformation is real. And that countering it is really roll up your sleeves work. It's not declarations from on high, but it is deep, trusting relationships that are sustained and that can then be called upon in moments of great challenge. So,
thank you, Julia, for reminding us how much we need to invest precisely to build this relationship of trust, that we will find it as a key resource when we are in situations of trouble. Let me turn to Professor Reddy and continue with this focus on scientific freedom, which by now you've understood is really key for UNESCO and all the institutions presented here today. With Professor Reddy, we have been engaged in research in 6 African countries within the context of a project on STI and strengthening STI systems in Africa. So we have looked at the scientific freedom in these countries. What are the key findings that come from that research, how they connect with the pandemic that we're experiencing?
Okay, thanks, Costas. Maybe I should start by just saying a few words about the project itself. Is this on? Oh, okay. The project Costas refers to is a subset, if you like, of a broad project, a UNESCO project on African perspectives on scientific freedom. That's the project which lives within a project on strengthening SDI systems. This is for sustainable development in Africa, and building a rights-based approach to science, technology, and innovation. Rather than taking an African-wide approach to the issue, there are 6 pilot countries, namely Congo, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Namibia, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. So the idea has been for those 6 countries, or researchers in those 6 countries, to drill into notions of scientific freedom, in particular with regard to the overarching policy and legislative environment, the key institutions, the enabling environment, and also with a view to identifying gaps and therefore ultimately making recommendations. So I have a role in the project of essentially, in the first place, working with the 6 countries as they bring their particular country-based work to completion. And sometime soon, I have to bring all of this together in a concluding section of the report. So you asked about, what are the messages or the findings that have emerged so far. Let me just mention a few. Almost I should say without exception, the notion of scientific freedom is, at best, implicit in either the legislation or in the policy environment in these countries, perhaps embedded within notions of human rights, referring, for example, to the UN Declaration. And one might find that, say, in the constitutions of many, if not all of these countries. But it really doesn't go beyond that. And so that does beg the question as to how does it work in the country concerned? To what extent is there an awareness of scientific freedom and adherence, if you like, to it as a basic principle, and measures taken to uphold it? Again, most, if not all, of the countries have had a great deal to say about the enabling environment, or the extent to which it might not be an enabling environment. And I'm not referring here to restrictions on scientific freedom, but rather lack of access to resources, lack of coordination, lack of critical mass of researchers and so on, all of which hinder scientific work, scientific progress, and therefore, if you like, in one way or another, fall foul of the notion of equitable access in the first place, but equitable access to scientific information. Much discussion about the aspiration in many African countries, and I think it's an AU goal as well, of spending of 1% of GDP on research, and I can tell you no African country is near that. In South Africa, we just got there some years ago, but have not been able to maintain that at all. There was a great deal of attention given to gender in many, if not all, of the reports, particularly with regard to measures taken to promote access by girls and young women to scientific education and also to careers in science. And in many cases, I would say that I found that to be most encouraging, to note the very explicit measures that were taken in policies, but also in many cases translated into action. One further aspect that I could comment on, and that has emerged in the reports, is really what I would regard as really an absence, almost a complete absence of engagement with the notion of scientific freedom. So it's not so much antipathy to the notion, but rather a lack of engagement, and I'm referring here to both the scientific community and to policymakers. And I think that there is an area in which there is great work to be done, and I would anticipate some strong recommendations coming forward in that regard. Just a final point, if I may just turn to, in some cases, challenges to legislation that was deemed to be a curb on scientific freedom. So, for example, in Ghana, there was the Public Universities Bill, which resulted in considerable debate in the universities and beyond because of perceived and perhaps real ultimately restrictions on the kind of autonomy that universities ought to enjoy. Well, that bill has subsequently been withdrawn. So I think that is an example of democracy at work. In other cases, in other examples, the colleagues have referred to what they regard as legislation, research acts or science and technology acts, which well, depending on one's interpretation, might be regarded as resulting in some measure of constraints in the way in which scientists may go about their work. For example, checks on data before the articles or the papers on which the data is based being able to be submitted for publication in the peer-reviewed literature. Not something that one would feel very comfortable about. And also some indications of donor-related restrictions on publication, which frankly I still need to get to the bottom of to understand, because there are certainly situations in which donors might place particular conditions on publication and the like, and I don't know about whether it has to do with that or whether restrictions of the kind which I think really should not be acceptable. Maybe I'll leave it at that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let me now turn to Professor Fobosi. We heard from this UNESCO emerging research that scientific freedom is a concept, an area that is not yet engaged in the countries under review. But we can say that also with regard to the right to science, which is the broader framework within human scientific freedom is embedded. And so my question to you is, how can we promote the agenda of the right to science in Africa and in African countries, knowing that the right to science is not part of the African Charter in Human and People's Rights? The floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Constance. I think before I respond to that, which is very important, let me just speak to the fact that there was a talk briefly about pandemics, and I would like to say that in my view, pandemics, I think what I've found is that they are invitational. They're invitational because they forces us to think, to imagine. They invite us to engage, to imagine a different world, a world full of possibilities, a world where everyone can benefit from those scientific development. So such pandemics then make us think, and say, look, what can be done better given what is happening? And we know for a fact of what happened in terms of COVID-19, which is still happening now. Briefly in relation to South Africa, some people not benefiting from this health, developments that are being offered, or not having, let me say, medical aids or not being able to access, health care. So those are some of the challenges that the ordinary people are facing. So then COVID-19 then forces us to think of a different world that where all the people can then benefit from all those developments that are being offered. And that COVID-19 as well forces us to think of a different world, especially in terms of education, where the right to education can still be realized even if there are pandemics. And you will know for a fact that COVID-19 forced most countries to have their schools or universities closed. And what is then the response? To make sure that the right is realized, continues. And as a result, most institutions rather implemented blended learning, so that right can still be realized. It can be practiced as it were. So that's the practice, in my view, of thinking of a different world. Of what I said in the beginning, pandemics being invitational, inviting us to think of a different world. So to say, look, how can we then think of a world where people benefit? So, and in my view, I think we should not wait for instances where there are pandemics. It means then that we have the capacity to think. We have the capacity to imagine a different world, when we are, implementing such different changes in a short space of time because of pandemics such as COVID-19. So it means, therefore, that we have a capacity to imagine a different world, to say we can change different issues that are affecting the ordinary people, in the underclass, those people that are still not benefiting from those developments, so we can still imagine a different world in that regard. And I think, Constance, the right to development, to science, can be realized through various engagements, whether through writing papers by academics, or through workshops, or through seminars, or through conferences, where academics then present papers, or even write short pieces, or where even the leaders themselves, the government leaders themselves, are pushing that agenda or including that right to science in their policies, so that any policies that is put in place can then be realized for the benefit of the ordinary people. Thank you.
Thank you, Sia. Indeed, we need policies that really reflect the advancements that we have achieved over the decades through international instruments and international frameworks. But having done 2 rounds of presentations, I think it's a moment to take a breath. There's a nice video coming from International Science Council about their work on the pandemic and COVID-19. Please put the video on, and then we move to questions and answers from you.
What does it mean when we say to somebody, you should isolate, when they live in a one-room home with 6 other people?
How will COVID-19 affect the future of my children?
Are we ready for the next pandemic?
When COVID-19 hit, it hit us bad. We've got learners who lost their parents. Now we have the child-headed families. I've got a learner in grade 12. She lost her mom. At home, she has to become a parent, and I can see that it's really affecting her. I am a teacher with chronic illness, but I had to be there, knowing that I'm just taking a huge risk with my life. But thanks God, I made it this far.
Quite early on in the pandemic, I got infected myself. I had been fighting viruses my whole professional life, and here a virus got me. It makes me more determined to stop it and to do something about it. We now need to think through what are the long-term impacts, because it's hugely complex. If you're a political leader, a decision maker today, it's not easy.
We're doing the convergence for the HIV run.
Okay, so you're doing viral loads.
Yeah.
COVID-19, by its very nature, puts a huge pressure on the healthcare services. When we go into a wave, the cases rise rapidly, the pressure on oxygen supplies, on ICU facilities, all of that comes under huge pressure. In COVID, it became a really serious problem.
We need to accept the fact that this virus will be with us for a long, long time. From epidemic, it becomes endemic. Therefore, we need to look at it from the perspective of different parts of the world. One of the sad impacts of this pandemic has been to exacerbate inequalities that already exist.
In March last year, the government declared that the schools will be closed.
The parents have not enough resources to help their kids. And the most worrying factor is we didn't have any access to internet or technology.
This virus was now shining a very bright light on one of our great inequities, and that's access to data. So what are we seeing here?
So we're looking at our blood sample
Yeah.
here, and we're looking at the cells and the count of
Okay.
the cells.
Let's look at that. Our efforts to stave the spread of the virus in schools was actually doing quite a lot of harm. They were no longer getting their once-a-day meal. They were not getting any education. Now we were going to get a whole generation of students who are now 1 year behind.
In November 2020, the International Science Council convened a number of people to look into the longer term. Not only the health aspects, but also economic impact, social impact, governance, societal impacts. 80 people have been involved in this all over the world. What we're trying to do is not to predict the future, but to see likely scenarios.
You can't map out a pathway with the milestones if you don't know what your destination is. The problem is, if you map out a destination, you're not sure about whether that's the likely destination. And that's why it becomes so important for us to think about that long-term vision.
We've been looking at it through the lens of the health clock and what are the determinants, the virus itself, social policies, public policies, how people react. All this is a project that will paint a picture of where we're going and what the impact is of decisions we take today in terms of long-term scenarios. We know in epidemics it is act now or pay later.
We've learned that by understanding our interconnectedness, we can protect others. We can protect ourselves. Science gives us among our strongest weapons against this kind of threat.
Teaching is a calling. There are times when you just say, no, I'm fed up. But then you wake up the next day, you say, but now if I don't help them, who's going to help them? You are the one who can help. You have to be there for them.
How do we learn all of the bitter lessons from COVID-19? How do we need to respond as a world so that no one is left behind?
If this epidemic has taught us one thing, is that it's not over anywhere until it's over everywhere.
Thank you very much. And after this brief video, let's turn to the Q&A with the audience. So I have several questions. Excellent. Please, since we would like to take as many as possible, state your name and then as brief.
Yes,
please.
My name is Galileo Violini. I am from Colombian Academy of Sciences. I'm Galileo Violini from the Colombian Academy of Sciences, but a former UNESCO staff. So I'm fond of the open science policy. However, I think that the lesson you must learn from the pandemic is not only open science. In fact, there are a few things I would like to point out. First of all, The sentence, nobody left behind, this was said at Abu Dhabi, G20. Nothing happened. It was November 20. Then the second problem was, is it right for human rights that people who receive public financing have a monopoly of vaccine? Is it right that South Africa and India are defeated 3 times at the WTO? Because the WTO works with consensus, so the majority is not enough. This jeopardizes the system of the United Nations. This is not right. Is it right that a country can buy 4.5 times the need, their population, to Canada specifically, and nothing happens? Well, these are the things, in my view, which violate human rights. Now, this happened, but in my view, these are the things which must be faced with concrete proposal to avoid that this is repeated.
Thank you. Let's take another 2 from that side of the audience. The lady next.
Yes, hello. My name's Françoise Bayless. I'm from Canada, and you're absolutely right. We bought way more than we needed, and we did not share, and that's a problem. My question, however, is different. From the panelists, I've heard comments about the right to science and the right to the benefits of science, and I actually think they're different. And as somebody who works with pathogen research right now, dual-use research, et cetera, I'm really concerned about the broad use of the claim, the right to science. So I totally endorse the view that there's the right to the benefit of science, but I'd like you to comment on why there's slippage between those 2 phrases.
The lady in front, and then we will turn to the panelists for replies. Please, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Hiroko Tsuboi Friedman from the Science Council of Japan. Thank you very much for your presentations. The ISC actually put out the position paper saying that the science as the global public good. Now, back in September, this past September, in Mexico City, for culture, Mondial 2022, put out the declarations claiming that the culture as public, global public good. So, my question is the intersection. Do you see synergy? Of course, there should be, I think, for the culture and the science. But but what kind of potential synergy do you see if there is this phrase of the global public good in the phrase? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe another 2 questions, and at the 2 gentlemen at the back, and then I'll give a chance to the panelists to respond.
Thank you. I'm Roger Pilkey from the University of Colorado. Great panel. I've been leading a comparative study of response to the pandemic in science advisory mechanisms around the world. We have about 20 case studies. One of the things we found is that what we call shadow science advisory bodies, self-organizing groups of scientists in many countries, have led to exactly the sort of problem that we have, losing public trust, competing scientists. Pick your own favorite scientist out there. My question is, what responsibility do we have in the scientific community, and especially leading scientific organizations like AAAS, ISC, UNESCO, to help scientists understand the ethics and political ramification of deciding to challenge governments and government science advice? Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman next to you, and then we'll pass to...
Thank you very much. My name is Wale Tomori. I'm from Nigeria. I want to look at totally different thing about science and things. The thing is, the next epidemic, is Africa ready? And also to say that I think Africa has to learn a big lesson from what has happened, not to depend on equity. Equity will never work. Let's forget it. We're all pretending about equity. There's no equity in the world. There will never be equity in the world. The people who have overcome this inequity have fought for equity. They have not consumed equity. We must contribute to equity. That's the situation. And until we begin to look at it, that what can we contribute to the issue of equity? If we are waiting just to consume, when you bring nothing to the equity table, you get nothing. When you bring your raw materials, you get a raw deal. And that's what is happening. Time for us in Africa to wake up and forget about all this equity and move on to the fact that what are we contributing to the equity table?
Thank you. Who would like to start from our panel?
There you go. I think it's really broad because you're really getting into many structural issues, and I don't think that we will have the time to go into all of those. But I feel that the recommendation, and you talk about benefits of science or the right to science, and the fact is that the 2017 recommendation decided to broaden the perspective, not only in terms of who benefits from the scientific endeavors, but also to look at who produces these endeavors and how it is produced. What are the responsibility of the different stakeholders, the responsibility of governments, the responsibilities to guarantee the ecosystem, the free ecosystem to produce science, and also without interference and without trying to influence the outcomes of science. The responsibilities, as you mentioned, of scientists. We can not only talk about your protection or your rights, but also your own responsibility in terms of what you bring to the table and how you ensure that you're accountable. And therefore, the whole definition in the 2017 recommendation is really deep and broad. And the fact is that member states already signed to it. And therefore, we are no longer discussing the definitions. We're talking about implementation. And we're talking about holding them accountable for this very specific issue of putting science at the core of the human rights debate, but also at ensuring that this is a right. And therefore, I feel that for UNESCO, the role that we play is to ensure that when countries sign something, they deliver to it, and holding them accountable for whatever it concerns, because it's really related to it.
I want to pick up on Roger's point, because I actually think it's a key point. And it was mentioned last night in the opening ceremony. I'm not sure if it was by Pradeep or who. But scientists in the public sphere have two responsibilities. One is the generation of knowledge. One is the transmission of knowledge. And I think we saw in the pandemic both good and the bad side of that. And I think one of the dangers, and I mentioned in my earlier comments, was scientists were using it sometimes for their own egotistical purposes rather than producing to help society. And I think there's a huge problem in the ethics of the conduct of science, this conflict between, if you like, their right as a citizen to free speech and their obligations as a scientist to be responsible in the transmission of science. And there's a huge issue there which I don't think has been well thought through. The Science Council of Japan's document on the responsibility of science starts to head towards a possible guideline, but I think it's a huge issue. You can get accused of shutting up scientists by criticizing them for doing it. It's a huge issue. The other problem is many scientists go into the public sphere do not understand the complexity of policy making. And policy making is not made just on scientific evidence alone. There are many other dimensions to it, and therefore scientists who choose to comment or critique on what a government is doing should take the obligation on to understand how policy is made and make their comments in an informed way about what they're commenting on. So, Roger, I think you and I, well, we've talked on this before. We know that there's a real issue here, and I don't think and it links to all the dynamics of a very egocentric scientific culture that exists, where all the incentives relate to the individual.
I can expand on that, but So just to expand on that really briefly, you know, I agree. We could talk about this at length. There's at least two sides to the coin. At its root, though, and one is that scientists be trustworthy. Right? You know, I come from the biomedical sciences. The vehicle for that lives in every scientific paper produced, right? We tell you exactly what we did so that you can try to do what I did over again. We give you the context, and in our conclusion, we say, here's what I think this means, but I invite you, colleagues, to check my work. Here's what else it could mean, right? So at the scientific process itself is pretty good at its best as transparency, and there have to be check marks there. Our journals are one of those check marks, not just in the editorial process, but in our open data policies, in our retraction policies. So there's the trustworthiness of scientists, but then there's something that, and I've spoken to it several times, so I won't belabor it too much, but then there's the deep pull up your sleeves work of building trust with specific audiences and defining those audiences enough so that you can listen to them, right? So you can spend that time building trust. So at AAAS, we're focused on key kind of influencers, right? We're focused on a healthy relationship with the media, focused on a healthy relationship with policymakers. And it doesn't end there, but the specificity of that, because it needs to be a deep and trusting relationship, is important. It's not a declaration from on high. It's conversations over years and building out networks.
Would you like to come in?
Yes, briefly, Kostas. I'd just like to respond to 2 points. So first of all, going back to your question, if I understood you correctly, it was about educating scientists or the scientific community in their responsibility or role with regard to science advice. Look, indeed, you know, we say, and whether it's the ISC or academies, whatever, that scientists have this responsibility. I really don't think that it is understood, properly understood, or that even that most or many scientists are aware of that responsibility, which is as important as the responsibility to work ethically, to be fair, to strive for excellence, etc. So I think that scientific bodies, in the first place, have a major role to play there. Global organizations like the ISC, of course, are playing that kind of role, particularly through the Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science. But likewise, at the same time, it is up to, as well, academies, universities, and the like, to engage actively with this in the same way as they would engage actively with notions of scholarly good conduct and the like. That's the first thing. The second point I just want to comment on briefly concerns the question around, again, if I understood you correctly, culture as a global common good, as a global public good, in relation to science as a global public good. Well, you know, the only thing I would say there is that we've talked a lot here about science and science advice and pandemics and the like, but we did hear comments earlier and yesterday about the absolute joy of doing science, of marveling at scientific discoveries and the like. And frankly, I see no boundary between those aspects of science and the joy of enjoying poetry, music, and the like. And as a natural scientist, that would be my way of viewing it. In other words, as an intersection and overlap, if you like, between science and culture broadly. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Just briefly, I think any development as a result of science or any discovery, as it were, I think needs to be to the benefit of those people there. If there's a discovery, for example, that there be a mine wherever, then that mine really needs to benefit the people there in that location. So it can't be a fact that you have, whoever discovered the mine, is benefiting without employing people there, for example. So that's what I think relates to the right to development. And also, I think the scientific community has a responsibility to ensure that the right to science is realized, and the knowledge is broadened in terms of writing pieces, in terms of writing papers, and in terms of conference work, and many other issues. And of course, Africa can be ready, where there's engagement, and where leaders talk about these issues, and where even researchers, ordinary people, talk about these issues, talk about scientific benefits, and what can be made better of the situation. Thank you.
Let me ask our panelists whether they can stay for a couple of minutes or they have obligations. If not, I'll ask the audience to discuss. Okay, so 5 more minutes. In that case, it means that very quickly, go to the point so that we give an opportunity to respond.
Thank you so much. My name is Mohammed Zubair Rahim. I'm a researcher at Parliament. I just want to welcome Professor Gluckman's earlier remarks where he spoke about social science being included as part of the fraternity of science, because usually social science is neglected and looked down upon and not as a science. But also I find myself in the policy-making sphere, and also the issue of protection of researchers who provide research to parliamentarians and how to protect their independence is one of the issues that needs to be raised. And also something that perhaps the ISC should look at, because you mentioned the importance of policy making and the importance of scientists understanding the policy-making arena, that there must be some sort of emphasis for researchers and policymakers and a dedicated space for that kind of work to be done. So I want to invite you to do that. Thank you.
Please be as brief as possible so that we can take all questions, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Matthias Kaiser from the University of Bergen, and I try to be very brief because lunch is waiting. And I will take up a point where Peter was just taking this up now in the last round about these ethical challenges that we have seen through the pandemic. And I think there is a more general point behind that also. And that is something to do, well, you talked very nicely about freedom and responsibility, and we all agree on that. That's very close to my heart, right? But on the other hand, if we go a little bit deeper, we also see there's a tension very often revealed, because there are other things related to that. That is diversity, which is a part. We have in diversity in the sciences, which is part of the engine that drives, progress. On the other hand, that diversity also plays out in the fight for power and for the attention to power, as we have seen in the pandemic, where, the modelers in between themselves, or the modelers and the virologists. And I've seen this in other areas, what I work on, like in the food area, sustainable food. We see the tension between those that look for the top-down solution, sustainable food for everyone, a global solution. On the other hand, we have those that are, on the bottom up. So we see this politicization of the sciences. And my question is, yes, we have to take care of that, but how can we deal with all these responsibilities?
Thank you. Please, I beg you, avoid the statements. Go directly to the question. I think the esteemed panelists will really understand what is behind. Please, you have the floor. And then last question, the lady next to you.
Thank you very much. I am Lydia Borrell-Demian, Secretary General of Science Europe in Brussels. And my common question to the panel is about the trust in science. It's more of a general comment. Because if we ask for trust, we are asking like an act of faith in a way. So maybe we should change a little bit the way we express that and say that we want people to be confident that the processes in research are sound, and that's why scientists affirm what they say. So we don't ask people to trust, but to be confident.
Last question, please.
Thank you. Controversial because I'm going to talk about trust in science. And I'm Brenda Kupeka. I'm a medical doctor with special interest in social media. And COVID actually shone a spotlight on the issue of disinformation and the role played by social media. Science doesn't happen or exist in isolation, as mentioned by the colleague, and the importance of social scientists. So the question that I have is, what is it that scientists and the relevant bodies have to do to ensure that they empower scientists to have a voice that people, like ordinary people, can actually hear? Because people that are peddling misinformation and disinformation actually have digital skills that exceeds the ones that scientists have, and that's quite powerful. And I think it's something to take to the next pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you.
All those questions are related. First of all, I think it comes back to most scientists don't actually know what science is. And I suggest that one needs to think carefully about what defines science, which is a set of principles about a reliable knowledge, about an organized system of knowledge, which is based on explanations based on reality, logic, and rationality, and not on belief, dogma, or anything else. And that it's open and it's subject to evaluation by its peers. Now, you can define, but if we stick in those terms, then how social sciences and natural sciences, it's an artificial separation. And I think the sooner we get rid of these terms, the better. There's a continuity with an organized knowledge which needs to play out for knowledge to be useful to society, as well as knowledge that will be useful for future in future terms. And we heard beautiful words about that from Pradeep last night, so I'm not going to repeat on that. I think the issues of trust come down fundamentally. We have not done a good job in education, in our discourse about what science is and what science is not. It's important not to overclaim what science is as to say what it can do. Trust comes from humility, transparency, open science, open knowledge, not overclaiming what we do, and not having our other egotistical battles in public. And I think we have developed a science system which is very much got perverse incentives in it, which drive some of the behaviours that have been talked about by Matthias and others. And therefore, I think we've got those issues. Now, the last comment about social media is a lot harder, because we are dealing with a generic issue, not just about science, but about what's reliable knowledge, what's not reliable knowledge, and manipulation and targeting and all sorts of things. And I think it's one of the existential threats of our time. How do we deal with a new communication system where very few people with a lot of power can influence and target in very different ways? I'm not going to try and answer that question today, because I think it involves a lot of behavioral scientists, psychologists, and we haven't as a whole got an answer to that question. I mean, you can talk to anybody in this disinformation world. They can talk in high-level terms about combating it, but in reality, we don't know how to do it. I've got one way to do it: turn off the internet.
Well, that's quite extreme, I think. No, but let me just try to get into the substance, and I really feel this question of breaking the barriers between sciences is super important. We launched a conference in the social and human sciences at UNESCO to ask the social scientists, the psychologists, the behavioral, what they would have done differently in the COVID crisis. And lesson number one was to have multidisciplinary committees dealing with it. Not only the modelers, not only the economists, not only the life or livelihood experiences, but also because the social and human sciences give sense to the human being and the multiple expressions that we have, because we are not just consumers or workers or shutting down our business. We are human beings with expectations, with emotions, with relational. And what happened is that by just trying to save the physical health, which is what we did, or save the economics from moving, we forgot our spirit, plainly. And therefore, we have now this horrible crisis of mental health issues. We did not understood that we needed differentiated policies for different groups and from different people. The elderly dying because they were not touched, because they were not visited. The youngsters, we have 100% increase in mental health issues. So I feel it's unavoidable to bring the perspective of social and human sciences if we want to get it better. We always say education, education, education. Well, I was super impressed by the IMF of all the institutions in the world launching, and I love Kristalina, of course, but launching this report saying what happened with all this massive investment in education in Africa and Latin America that had not transformed into more formal jobs, into more quality jobs, into more social policies, social understanding why families bring people their kids to the education or not. So I think this is really unavoidable, and the ethical debate I think is also super important. But let me just add something to what Peter said in terms of how science, because we put a lot on science to prove themselves that we need to deliver or not, and that we need to convince because trust in science, not trust in science. The fact is that I feel that people know better. People know better, no matter where they are. People know better what their chances in life are and whether the system is delivering for them or not. And people don't think the system is delivering for them, and therefore the scapegoat is science. And you remember the Queen saying, where were the experts with the financial markets? So I think this question of being humble for scientists and recognizing that they don't have the truth and that they cannot pretend that wherever they put at the table needs to be followed 100%, because what happens is that, at least in my economic sphere, I said it, the global equilibrium, no, and all this herd behavior, I think was really damaging the profession, and now we need to rebuild it. Science will be trusted when it delivers for people. And when people see that the world is not so unfair and is not so unsustainable and is not so really damaging their chances. So you got me going, so I pass it.
Yeah, I'll just expand very briefly to say, beyond humility, we take very seriously that scientists need to sometimes expand their skill sets. So we listen to research that says, in terms of combating mis and disinformation, the whack-a-mole response, once it is out there, is limited returns come from that. So what we work to do is ensure that scientists with deep subject matter expertise that is kind of verified and validated by their community of peers also have access to media training, so that in their local media ecosystems, be that the news that's on TV and the print journalism, that they have connections, right? So we have a program that makes those connections, and that's very focused on ensuring that a diversity of scientists have that training, and that diversity is on levels. It's racial and ethnic, but it's also across, in the US context, which is where we're providing this service, that it's also spread across the nation. It's not just in New York City, Boston, and California, but that it's across the whole of the nation. People tend to trust their communities before they trust outsiders. So I think taking seriously that those platforms need to exist, I would venture a guess that you would be a phenomenal champion for medicine in your area, right? So building out platforms such as that, I think is a really important component to evolving within the ecosystem that we are in, because I think for most of us, turning the internet off is probably not an option.
Okay, thanks. You want me to be very quick, and I shall, yeah. Matthias, first of all, no, thank you. Absolutely point taken. It's not as clean as it sounds, freedom and responsibility in science. Although to some extent, I think the kinds of issues that you refer to, like diversity and the like, are embedded, depending on one's reading, are embedded in notions of fairness and so on, which are key components of responsibility in science. But it needs to be fleshed out much further than that, and we can talk about that later. About trust in science, I just wanted to make the point that the Wellcome Trust did a massive survey of trust in science in 2017 or thereabouts, pre-COVID anyway, and it showed that broadly, there is a very good degree of trust in science. It varies geographically around the world and so on, but really the numbers were much higher than I had expected. I'd be very interested in the results of such a survey if it were to be done again now post-COVID. There are significant threats to trust in science, some of which have been spoken about here. One of those, of course, being misconduct in science. So fortunately, the scientific world, the major journals and so on, have gotten to grips with this in a very open and explicit way around misconduct, plagiarism, and the like, all of which threaten the underpinnings of science. And the final point is that the scientific community has done itself a huge disservice in many cases, many instances, talking about humility, in conducting itself in exactly the opposite way, with great arrogance. For example, with regard to GMOs, not taking into account that not everybody who doesn't embrace GMOs is anti-scientific or pseudo-scientific. People come at it from various points of view, cultural and the like, and the scientific community missed a beat there. However, scientists have subsequently written very well on exactly that topic. Thank you.
A final quick word from Sia.
Right, thank you, Constance. Thank you. And I think definitely we can have trust in science when it empowers people, when it leads to the empowerment of people, rather. When people are not experiencing poverty, which is currently happening, when there are developments that empowers people, when learners at schools are still not using, pit latrines as a form of sanitation, which is still the case. So I think some of those problems that are happening, needs to be addressed. So science needs to be prioritized. The right to science needs to be prioritized. Thank you.
Just one thing, and I'm abusing the fact that this is a UNESCO panel, I'm sorry, but this question of misinformation, bring back the ethics. And again, the pseudoscience saying that regulation stifle innovation, we need to debunk that. And we have the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence to look at the issues there, because we have had this idea that if we go there to put some rules in the digital world, it will perish. But we don't think that's the case. We think that we really need to have good regulatory systems, and that's not for the science, that's for the policymakers, and that's a responsibility. And then the other point, STI systems in Africa, very proud to have you. And I hope that when we deliver the paper, Carl is here, Costas are running this project, I hope that we will find a different way to build the ecosystems for science, including all this rights-based approach. So that's what I want to say.
My last request is a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much, and really great success for the rest of the forum. Bon appétit.